Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. We're going to begin our hearing today by hearing evidence from two members of the London Fire Brigade. Who is your first witness, Mr. Kinnear?
Matthew Ramsey, sir.
Thank you very much. Yes, would you ask Mr. Ramsey to come then, please? Good morning, Mr. Ramsey.
Good morning.
I understand you'd like to take the oath, so there should be a testament there on the desk. Would you take it in your right hand and read the words on the screen, please?
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much indeed. Now sit down if you'd like to and make yourself comfortable. Good. Thank you. When you're ready, Mr. Kinnear.
Thanks, sir. Would you first please confirm your name for the record?
My name is Matthew Ramsey.
Mr. Ramsey, thank you very much for attending today. It's much appreciated. Before we start examination, I should make 3 points clear. First of all, if at any time you require a break, please don't hesitate to say so. Secondly, would you please keep your voice up so that the shorthand writer can capture everything you say and accurately. And thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, my questions are intended to be short and clear. Sometimes I don't achieve that aim. If it isn't clear, please don't hesitate to say so, and I'll rephrase it.
Thank you.
Now, you have made 5 witness statements in relation to the Grenfell fire, is that right?
That's correct.
Now, 2 have been made to the inquiry and 3 to the Metropolitan Police. If we can deal first of all with the 2 statements to the inquiry, your first one was dated the 24th of January 2019, which can be found at LFB 000-32092. Is that it?
That is, yes.
And your second statement is dated the 11th of December 2019, which can be found at LFB 000-83855. Is that it?
That is it, yes.
Your first statement for the Metropolitan Police, dated the 11th of January 2018, which can be found at Met 000-56699. Is that it?
That's correct, yes.
Your second statement for the Metropolitan Police is dated the 8th of July 2019, which is at Met 000-56992. Is that it?
Yes.
And thirdly and finally, your third statement for the Metropolitan Police, dated the 17th of June 2020, which can be found at Met 000-71003. And is that statement?
Yes, it is.
Thank you. Have you read those statements recently?
Yes, I have.
And can you confirm their contents are true?
Yes, I can.
And you're happy for those to be taken as your evidence to this inquiry?
Yes.
Thank you. Now, first of all, could I talk to you about your role, experience, training and qualifications? Now, you have set out in your statement the background, roles and responsibilities in your first statement to the inquiry. You state that you were employed by the LFB in the fire safety team as a fire safety inspecting officer from September 2007 onwards. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And that the Hammersmith and Fulham fire safety team, which you were initially a member of, merged with the Kensington and Chelsea fire safety team in April 2012. Is that right?
Yes.
And that your team leader was originally Nicholas Comrie between 2007 and March 14.
Yes.
And Rebecca Burton from March 2014 to June 2017. Is that right?
That's correct.
And she was in turn succeeded by Ben Dewis.
That's correct.
Thank you. Now, you set out at paragraph 7 of your first statement to the inquiry your role as a fire safety inspecting officer, and that job entailed inspecting buildings, advising and taking enforcement action against responsible parties, and dealing with concerns raised by the public. Is that a fair summary of the key elements of your role?
Yes, I believe it is.
Now, it was in that role that you were involved in issues relating to flat entrance doors of RBKC TMO properties, as well as Grenfell Tower, when you inspected it in March 2014. Is that correct?
Yes.
And finally, is it right that you left the LFB in April 2018 or thereabouts?
Yes, I did.
Thank you. Now, I want now to turn to your experience, training, qualifications in relation to fire safety inspections, and specifically high-rise residential buildings. Now, if we can turn to LFB 000-32092/4, and at paragraph 12 of your first statement to the inquiry, you say there in the first line that everyone in the fire safety team had their own area of specialism, and going on to the fourth line, generally, I did take the lead on high-rise inspections, but not exclusively. Were you the lead inspecting officer in relation to high-rise residential buildings?
I think for the most part, I did that role, yes. It wasn't a formal appointment as such. It was just the way that tasks were divided initially by Nicholas Comery, and I looked after high-rise, other officers looked after schools and hospitals, and it was just an easy way of best using the skills within the team.
Thank you. And did you receive any training specific to the fire safety aspects of high-rise residential buildings?
I don't believe I received specific training, although we did make sure that we were absolutely familiar with the guidance, especially that was available at the time.
And how did you do that?
Reading it personally by attending, where possible, training seminars, if such were available. I don't recall any specifically, but I know I attended a few. I couldn't find details of the ones I had attended. And also just through experience of other officers, working with other officers such as Nick Comery, gained experience that way.
Put differently, do you feel that you had sufficient training for your job?
I felt so at the time.
Thank you. Now, if we turn over the page in this statement to page 5, and between paragraphs 15 to 17, you set out your training qualifications. Can you explain, first of all, what training you had in relation to completing fire safety audits?
So when I started in September 2007, training was provided in-house by experienced officers who, we did a long series of training modules before we were ever allowed to go out and inspect any form of premises. And so the in-house training, an in-house development folder, which was to demonstrate my competence to my team leader over my first year or so of work, I think gave me a good grounding.
And would it flow from the answer you gave some questions ago that you were familiar with the Local Government Association's guide entitled Fire Safety in Purpose-Built Blocks of Flats?
Yes, I was familiar with that.
Now, as of 2013, you were also registered as an Auditor of Fire Risk Assessment on the Institution of Fire Engineers Professional Register. What prompted you to obtain that particular accreditation?
It was made available. It was a way of demonstrating my competence in the role as inspecting officer.
And how did that qualification inform or guide the way you approached your job?
It was an assessment of my knowledge, first of all on paper, and then in an interview. And my competence was assessed by experienced senior officers from a different brigade. And then I was deemed sufficiently competent to be included on the register. And it was, not all officers were on the register at that time. Some found it difficult to get on, but thankfully myself, and I remember Nick Comery also being a member of that register.
Thank you. Now, I want to turn on to issues that arose in relation to flat entrance doors on the RBKC TMO estate. And the first specific issue I'd like to discuss with you is a meeting on the 8th of November 2012 between the LFB, RBKC and TMO. Now, if we can go to LFB 000-32092/13, you set out in paragraphs 47 to 48 of this statement a meeting on the 8th of November 2012. Can you remember now why you had been invited to attend the meeting?
Yes, this meeting was solely in relation to the TMO's approach to managing leaseholder flat entry doors, as I recall.
And you were there presumably because of your interest in high-rise residential buildings?
Not specifically that. I had undertaken an inspection of a building where there was a leaseholder door that was significantly substandard, non-compliant. I believe presented a risk to the rest of the building residents. And this was a good example of the lack of management of leaseholder doors.
And was that door at Grenfell, or was it another building, part of the TMO stock?
It was at another building, Gilray House, as I recall.
Now, you say in paragraph 48, which is on the screen, that your attendance was limited to explaining facts, i.e. particular buildings where non-compliant doors had been identified, and detailing what the potential risks were with non-compliant front doors. Do you remember the particular buildings you identified? You've already mentioned Gilray. Were there any others?
Yes. Of particular interest, I think, would have been Adair Tower, which was something that a significant fire before Grenfell Tower, the Grenfell Tower fire. And there were a number of other lower rise buildings where there have been significant issues with a failure to provide adequate self-closing devices to doors.
And for the avoidance of doubt, was Grenfell Tower any of those buildings which you cited in this meeting?
No.
In broad terms, can you give us the gist of the non-compliances you'd identified?
Yes, so a fire door or fire door set is made up of a number of component parts. We have the door leaf, we have things like the hinges, the letterbox, the door frame itself, any closing devices. So significant deficiencies really would be if there had been holes in and around the frame, or the frame had been made of insubstantial materials, whether the door leaf to the door set was likely, because of its construction, to resist a fire or not, and whether the door was self-closing effectively, i.e. it fully closed into the frame.
Were there any maintenance issues that had caused you concern?
Many, yes.
Again, would you mind giving the panel the gist of the maintenance issues you'd identified?
On many inspections, I sampled flat entry doors, which meant that I would knock on a number of doors, not knowing whether they were leaseholder doors or tenanted doors, to see whether the door was adequately fire resisting and self-closing. That was my common practice at the time.
Now, Andy Jack, in his statement to the police dated the 7th of May 2019, we don't need to go to it, but the reference is Met 000 4 0001/15, second paragraph, first line. He said this in relation to the 8th of November meeting: an additional conversation took place after the close of the meeting to discuss enforcement in respect of flat front doors. Do you recall an additional conversation after the close of the meeting?
I don't believe I was involved in that additional conversation.
Can you help us as to who stayed after the close of the meeting? Or was it?
I'm sorry, I don't recall.
Now, also in that statement, Andy Jack says that he made the following point about self-closing devices. We further discussed the issue of doors and door closers in relation to the maintenance and management requires of the order. The point being made by me that collectively there was a need not only to maintain doors and self-closing devices in an efficient manner, in an efficient state and good working order, but this should be subject to effective planning, organisation, control, monitoring and review. Now, can you remember Andy Jack making that point in the substantive meeting which you attended?
Absolutely, yes.
You say absolutely yes. Why do you have such a clear recollection of that?
That was the main thrust of his argument. It was so essential to maintain these doors in that state for the safety of the building, and that doing anything else just wasn't appropriate.
Was anything in the substantive meeting discussed regarding the maintenance and monitoring requirements in relation to flat entrance doors?
I believe it may have been, but I don't recall any detail.
Given that a flat entrance door replacement programme had been taking place between 2011 and 2013, was there any discussion of maintenance requirements and monitoring requirements in relation to that door replacement programme that you can remember?
I don't recall.
Andy Jack says that he recalls in the meeting a discussion about checking of fire-resisting compartmentation generally as part of the fire risk assessment process. Do you remember that subject being discussed in the substantive meeting?
I don't recall.
Andy Jack says that he highlighted the possibility of carrying out types of checks in flats which have become vacant, otherwise known as a void. In the substantive meeting, do you remember any discussion of that matter?
I don't recall that detail.
Now, can I move away from that meeting to email correspondence in relation to flat entrance doors and flowing from your answers that you'd identified issues elsewhere on the TMO estate? Could we go first of all to CST 000020038/3, and in particular the bottom half of the page, which is an email from Mr. Ramsey to Janice Ray. And there we go, 29th of November 2013, sent at 16:47, entitled Fire Safety at Elm Park House. Do you remember sending that email, Mr. Ramsey?
Yes, after reading it in the bundle of material I've been supplied with, yes, I do remember that email.
Now, if I can ask us to go to LFB quadruple 03534/1, we should have Miss Ray's response. Thank you. Dated the 18th of December 2013, and Nicholas Comrie was copied in. It's the email sent to you. Do you remember that response?
Yes, on reading it.
Now, we see item 1 of that email, first paragraph. Janice Ray noted your concern about self-closing devices at Elm Park and explained the TMO's approach to flat entrance doors had been discussed consistently with the LFB over recent years, including the meeting the day before. Janice Ray then sets out the TMO's approach to tenant doors thus, and I quote, "When replacement flat entrance doors are fitted, they are fire-rated and self-closing. When properties become void, self-closers will be reinstated, installed as necessary. At other times when major work has been undertaken in a dwelling, the self-closer will be reinstated if it has been disconnected." From the lay perspective, Mr. Ramsey, that appears to suggest that for doors with self-closers installed, those self-closers would only be inspected and reinstated as necessary when the property became either void or major works were carried out. Was that how you read that email?
That's how I read it. Whether I believed it was sufficient or not is something different.
Well, that prompts my next question. Did you consider that approach to be sufficient to discharge obligations under the fire safety order?
Certainly not.
And in what respects did you feel that this fell short?
It was so easy for any door to become non-compliant over that period of time. It could be many years between tenants. I've been in my house for 10 years, so it could be 10 years between checks, which is clearly insufficient to ensure something as important as a self-closer was functioning.
Can you remember now whether you responded to that email by an email of your own or in a telephone conversation or in a meeting?
I don't recall, but the email itself is also copied into Nicholas Comrie, who was my team leader at the time. He was aware of this issue, and he had regular team meetings with the TMO and would no doubt have taken this forward.
Put bluntly, did you approve expressly or impliedly the approach that is summarised in item 1 of this email?
No.
To the best of your knowledge, did Mr. Comrie ever approve the approach set out in this email?
No.
Would he have kept you up to date on discussions he'd had with the TMO on this issue or indeed any other issue?
In most cases, yes.
Did you have cause to discuss the contents of this email with Mr. Comrie?
I don't recall, but I think it's highly likely that we did.
Now, can I turn to the third statement you provided to the Metropolitan Police, and that can be found at Met 000-71003/5. And if we go to the third paragraph on that page and the fourth line, where you say this in relation to Janice Ray and Carl Stokes. At times, I felt they were economical with the truth, especially in regard to the standards of flat entry doors. I can't say for certain that they outright lied, but I'm not entirely sure the whole truth was told. They claimed that the fire doors were up to standard. This had proved untrue during my audits of TMO-managed premises. Having undertaken inspections subsequently, I know there are blocks within the borough where a number of the flat doors inside were not up to fire safety standard, so the information they gave about the refurb programme at that point didn't stack up, close quotes. Now, just for the avoidance of doubt, in relation to that comment, are you thinking about flat entrance doors in particular?
Yes.
What did you mean when you said, quotes, they claimed that the fire doors were up to standard, this had proved untrue, close quotes?
Well, I think at times information fed back from I think it was bi-monthly meetings that the TMO had suggested that there were very few non-compliant flat entry doors remaining. However, each time I'd done an audit on a TMO premises, I found, a significant number. In one premises, I think Barrington Walk, tested in one of the finger blocks adjacent to Grenfell, there were more non-compliant front doors in just those blocks than there had been in the whole, in what Janice had described as being non-compliant.
Did you raise the fact and extent of the non-compliances, first of all, with the TMO itself?
Not with the TMO, no.
Who did you raise those concerns with?
I remember having discussions with my team leader at the time.
And do you know what your team leader did in respect of those concerns about the fact and extent of non-compliances you'd identified?
I don't know.
Now can I turn to your inspection of the tower on the 12th of March 2014, which led to your issuing a notice of deficiency on the 24th of March 2014. Now, before I ask you about the inspection, can I ask you to turn to the notice itself, which can be found at LFB 000 32101. And we can see from the top left-hand corner, it's addressed to the TMO alone. Why wouldn't you address a notice such as this to RBKC as well?
The instructions I'd had from my team leader were to address in this way.
And did he give you an explanation as to why?
He felt that when he'd spoken with the enforcement team at Union Street head offices, that they'd told him this was the appropriate approach to take.
Now, turning to your site visit on the 12th of March 2014, was the audit of the tower primarily triggered by your concerns regarding the poor state of the smoke management system and or some other reason?
Yes.
So it's a smoke management system?
Smoke management system, yes.
Now, can we go to LFB 000 83856? Now, is what we see here everything that you recorded during the course of your site visit on the 12th of March 2014?
I believe that's what's ultimately recorded. I may have initially made notes in one of the entry boxes whilst on site, and then returned to the office to type up, and this is what is left.
And am I right that this information was recorded on a tablet device provided by the LFB to you for the purposes of recording what you encounter on visits?
That's correct.
Now, the first thing I'd like to ask you about this is who attended this site visit. In your first inquiry statement, and we don't need to go to it, but it's paragraph 18, LFB 000 32092/5, you listed the attendees as yourself, Daniel Hallisey, Janice Ray and Carl Stokes. Is that right?
I believe so, though looking at other documentary evidence, it would suggest that Janice may not have been there.
That's the point I wanted to ask you about. And if I take you through some of the documents we have, it may sort of prompt your memory. Now, we have an email written the day after the site visit, and it's at TMO 100 5515/2. And if we can go to the bottom of the page, we see there an email from Bruce Soons of Studio E to Claire Williams, Janice Ray, Carl Stokes, and another. And if we turn over the page, to the top of page 3, we see that Mr. Soones records that the fire brigade visit Grenfell Tower 13th of March, Ben Lewis, Matthew Ramsey, Dan Hussey. Now, he's got the names of Mr. Jewis and Mr. Hussey wrong, but do you think it's right that those were the people who attended on behalf of the LFB?
Yes.
And was Bruce Soones present as well?
I don't recall.
Claire Williams?
I believe Claire was there. I don't have a clear recollection of all attendance.
It doesn't appear that either Miss Ray or Mr. Stokes were there on the basis of this email.
Then I may well have been mistaken in that regard.
Now, can I now turn to the information which you obtained before the inspection? And if I could ask you to turn to LFB 000-83855/6, and it should be paragraph 14 of your second statement to this inquiry, the third line. You say it was your normal practice to request a copy of the fire risk assessment before completing an inspection, but on this occasion you did not ask for it beforehand, and you only received it by email 2 days after the inspection and before you completed the premises inspection and data collection form. And you go on to say, if I can go to another statement, in your paragraph 21 of your first statement to the inquiry, which is at LFB 000-32092/6. If we look at paragraph 21, the fourth line from the bottom in particular, you say, I needed a copy of the fire risk assessment in order to complete my audit inspection. It acts as a baseline for considering the weaknesses and strengths of a building, and I would have considered it prior to and during and after my subsequent inspection. Do you think the absence of the FRA before your inspection denied you the chance fully to consider the strengths and weaknesses of Grenfell Tower, for example?
There may have been items listed within the fire risk assessment which I wasn't aware of without having viewed it, of course. I would have seen everything within the common parts, especially the areas that I had of particular concern in relation to the ventilation system. It's always useful to see the fire risk assessment ahead of time and to consider it again at the end of the audit process to make sure that it is suitable and sufficient. There's no way of determining whether a fire risk assessment is suitable and sufficient without also considering the premises in person.
Do you think its absence in any way altered or undermined the rigour or depth of the inspection you carried out on the 12th of March?
I don't believe so, because I had the opportunity after the audit, if necessary, to return to the premises. My audit wasn't complete until I'd considered the fire risk assessment.
And if we could turn to your second statement to the inquiry, which can be found at LFB 000-83855/5 and paragraph 13. And you say there in the first 5 lines, you don't recall receiving the separate record of significant findings and action plan for Grenfell Tower for your audit, and you don't recall asking for it as Janice Ray had provided the FRA, which you, quotes, felt was generally suitable and sufficient and provided me with enough information to discharge my duties, close quotes. As a matter of practice, would you usually examine and interrogate the record of significant findings and action plan?
Yes.
And why would you do that?
I need to take into consideration what the TMO had identified for themselves, what action they were taking to make improvements. So it would be unfair to enforce if they'd identified and made plans to correct a problem. If they'd already done that was good.
Now, can I turn to the information you gathered during the course of the site visit and inspection? First of all, how long did the site visit inspection take? Can you remember?
I don't recall. I would estimate from typical inspections around an hour and a half.
Now, can we look at the first topic, which is inspection of the means of escape? And could I ask you to turn to LFB 000-83856/10. And we have audit conclusion box. It's under management compliance. Thank you. And you'll see there stated 70% audited escape routes. Just to be absolutely clear, does that mean that you audited and inspected 70% of the escape routes?
That's correct.
Is there a particular importance about the 70% figure?
No, it's just a factual figure. So we would not always have to view the entire premises. If we felt that we had an accurate picture of the premises condition, and by auditing a sample, then we could shorten the audit, which was always helpful to the responsible person. This was particularly useful in a very well-managed premises, because you wouldn't need to look at everything in every detail if the premises was well managed. So the purpose of this was to shorten as far as possible audits for the responsible person.
And just,
sorry.
I'm sorry, Mr. Ramsey, I cut across you. Is there anything, I didn't want to cut off your answer.
I think by having looked at 70% of the premises I'd found and talking with staff, I had enough information to draw conclusions.
And although
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Mr. Kinnear. Mr. Ramsey, I noticed that you rated the management compliance at level 2 above average. How many levels were there to choose from?
There are 5 levels, well, 6 in terms of really terrible premises, but in practical speaking, there are 5 levels. This is not me making that decision. This is the software within the tablet.
Oh, right.
Based on my entries into that tablet, this management compliance level is automatically assigned.
I see. And so is 2 the second from the top?
Yes, it is.
Right. I think that's helpful to know that. Thank you.
Thanks, sir. And just looking at the 70% figure, although expressed in percentage terms, is that more of a broad brush indication of the extent to which you inspected the means of escape?
That's accurate, yes.
Now can we turn to the second topic, which is inspection of flat entrance doors themselves. And if we can leave this document and go to your first statement to the inquiry, which can be found at LFB 000-32092/6 and paragraph 19. And 4 lines from the bottom of that paragraph, you say this, and I quote, "I was told the flat front doors were going to be upgraded to ensure they were all suitably fire resistant and self-closing as part of the refurbishment project. I did not, therefore, focus on flat front doors during my site visit, as I'd been told by Janice Ray a plan was in place to rectify this issue." Do you remember when you were told that particular piece of information by Janice Ray?
No, I don't recall.
Are you able to give the panel the gist of the detail you were provided regarding the door replacement programme at that stage?
I wasn't given great detail in relation to what doors were being chosen, what blocks were being, where the doors were being replaced. Those discussions were held at the bi-monthly team meetings held with my team leader and Janice Ray, so I didn't attend those meetings.
Okay. So can we take it that you were not aware at this stage, i.e. March 2014, that almost all of the flat entrance doors, except those owned by leaseholders at Grenfell Tower, had been upgraded between 2011 and 2013? No,
I wasn't aware of that.
Thank you. Now, when you usually undertake inspections of flat entrance doors, do you try to gain access to flats to inspect them and inspect items such as the self-closing devices, strips and seals on the inside?
Absolutely my common practice in every high-rise premises that I undertook audits in, yes.
Can it be reduced to such crude terms? Do you have a sort of a percentage of doors in a high-rise residential building that you'll try and inspect?
I wouldn't say I had a percentage, but I would certainly usually start at the top, knock on 1 or 2 doors on that level if I wasn't able to gain access, carry on knocking until I did gain access, which was difficult at times, and wouldn't leave until I got a reasonable picture, as far as I could, a reasonable picture of what was available. So I can't give you a figure of how many doors I would knock on. or how many doors I'd be happy with. It would be more in relation to the condition of the doors that I did find. So if I knock on 5 doors and manage to get 5 open and all are self-closing, I'm going to be reasonably happy with that.
Would a visual inspection of the external doors give you some insight into the rigour of the maintenance regime?
Very little insight.
Can I now turn to a premises information form which can be found at LFB 000-83856/7, and in particular the heading Article 14, which is in the third line of observations at the bottom of the page. You note there, and it's the sentence that starts on the far right-hand side, third line down, flat entry doors all appear to be suitably fire-resisting. Majority of entry doors are newly installed, are fitted as self-closing. Some leaseholder doors are FR, leaves it is unknown whether these are self-closing with approved self-closers. Now, that suggests, at least to the lay eye, that you'd had the opportunity to inspect at least some leaseholder doors. Is that a fair reading of that summary?
I would have noticed the difference between doors that have been replaced possibly by the TMO with new doors. Those doors remaining were most frequently leaseholder doors. I can see that the door itself, I'm saying here, the door appears to be a fire-resisting door leaf of sufficient thickness and construction, but I wasn't able to gain access to actually inspect whether those doors were self-closing.
Now, where you observe that all flat entry doors appear to be suitably fire-resisting, you'd reach that view through the method you've just explained to the panel, I assume?
Yes.
Can you recall now, and please confirm if you can't, how many flat entrance doors you weren't able to, or how many you were able to inspect?
I don't recall.
Can you help us as to how you reached the conclusion that, quotes, the majority of entry doors are fitted as self-closing?
The only thing, I don't specifically remember this, the conversations I had around this audit. My common practice at the time was, as I said before, to sample doors. So I believe I must have witnessed visibly the doors self-closing effectively.
Thank you. If I can now turn to inspection of lifts, Mr. Ramsey, and if I can ask us to go to LFB 000-83855/2, which is your second statement to this inquiry, and paragraph 4, and the first line, you say you don't recall any discussions regarding lifts on that occasion. And if we can go on to paragraph 7 of this statement on page 3. In the first line you say this: I've been provided with a copy of an email from Claire Williams sent to Janice Ray on the 12th of March 2014 at 15:42 hours. I note Claire's comment, Carl, can you please confirm that the lifts are either firemen's or firefighting? I did not realise the difference. Now, at paragraph 9 of your second statement to this inquiry, you accept, having read this email, it was possible a discussion about lifts took place. Can you provide us with any information as to whether you or Daniel Hallisey or Ben Dewis sought confirmation as to the type of lift that was installed at Grenfell?
No. I don't recall the specific conversations very well at this time. Obviously, the emails indicate that there was a discussion in place. I wanted to understand the standard of lift at the building. I was also aware by this time that there was likely to be a major refurbishment of the building and that lifts would be a part of that major refurbishment.
Can you remember whether you received any confirmation as to the type of lift that was at Grenfell?
No, I don't believe I ever did.
Is that, again, the type of information that would have been communicated to your team leader rather than yourself?
No, that should have been communicated to me.
Were you ever made aware that the lifts at Grenfell were not firefighting lifts?
I wasn't given confirmation of the type of lift that was there. By looking at the lift, I didn't believe that they were modern standard firefighting lifts, but I wanted confirmation of what their understanding was.
Do you remember having any subsequent discussion with Mr. Comrie or Mr. Dewis or indeed Mr. Hallisey after the site visit regarding the type of lift that was at Grenfell?
No.
Can I now turn to LFB 000-32093/6? Now, this is the FRA for Grenfell Tower, dated the 20th of November 2012. That's the one you were provided with following the site visit in March 2014. And we see in the first box, third paragraph, the final sentence, the lifts are described as firefighting/evacuation lifts. We don't need to go to the relevant pages, but that formula is repeated at internal pages 5, 14, 20, and 25 of the FRA. Did you consider, or did that reference prompt any further consideration of the type of lift that was at Grenfell after your visit?
To be honest, I don't recall giving that the consideration probably due. There's no chance that they would have been evacuation lifts. It's possible they had been firefighting lifts. There's absolutely no chance for evacuation lifts, which are not commonly fitted into residential buildings.
Now, can we turn back to your second statement in the inquiry in paragraph 9, which can be found at LFB 000-83855/3. Thank you. And in the second line of that paragraph, you say that it would be my usual practice when conducting an inspection to check that the brigade would have access to the lift and that the drop keys could be used to transfer the lift operation under the brigade's control. I cannot recall whether I conducted this check at the Grenfell Tower inspection in March 2014. Was it standard LFB practice, as opposed to your own personal practice, to carry out that particular check?
No, I don't believe it was. Not all officers carried the key necessary to undertake that check.
Would that involve a physical test as to whether the drop key was working or not?
Yes.
Would you have carried out that check on this visit, given your personal habit?
Personal habit, yes. I can't give that firm assurance of the inquiry.
Thank you. Can I now turn on to the question of the premises information pack? Now, do you recall suggesting the premises information pack should be held in the reception of Grenfell Tower?
Yes.
Why did you feel it was necessary? What were its advantages?
One of the most important things in the event of a fire is for firefighters to have a good knowledge of the layout of the building, the layout of flats. This is really useful information to operational fire crews. I wanted to make sure that if there had been a fire at Grenfell Tower, crews had readily available information about the layout of the building.
Thank you. Now, can I turn now to the inspection of the smoke control system itself, and in particular the emails between Claire Williams, Bruce Soons and Janet Ray after your visit? And first of all, could we go to TMO 100040930/4, which hopefully is Claire Williams' email of the 12th of March at 15:43. There we go. Now, she comments at item 2, Matthew, presumably you, was very unhappy about the existing state of the smoke vents to each lobby. Of those looked at, about 30% were not in the right position. I've been chasing RGE for 2 months now on their servicing records and had nothing back. Matthew said about issuing us with notice to confirm fully functional in 6 weeks. And if we can stay in this chain but go up to page 2, and Bruce Soons' reply of the 13th of March, there we go, 2014 at 13:46, and just below halfway down, he comments, vents opened. There we go. It's immediately above it is a bullet point which says bike found chained to dry riser. And then we see vents open and closed, existing situation not working. Matthew Ramsey, very unhappy with fact dampers do not appear to be functional. Risk of 4-week enforcement notice. A demonstration would be required. This is urgent. Do the contents of the Williams and Soon emails fairly reflect your concerns expressed during the course of your inspection?
Yes, I certainly was very concerned about the poor state of the ventilation system. In my view at that time, I didn't need to see the servicing records. It was in such poor condition that it needed immediate repair. I don't recall ever requiring that they should demonstrate that to me, though.
Following on from the answer in relation to maintenance, could I ask us to turn to CST quadrupled 03115/1, and it's an email you sent to Janice around the 14th of March. And you asked for the FRA, and it's 4 lines from the bottom of the email. At the end of the line, you requested the maintenance records for the smoke vent system for the last 2 years. And as we discussed, approximately 25% of the vents do not appear to be in effective working order. And bearing that email in mind, could I ask us to go to your second statement of this inquiry, which is at LFB 0083855/4. And at paragraph 10, you say in the second line, I do not recall ever receiving the records and the system was in such a poor state. You assumed it had not been maintained for some time. That's a long run-up to a simple question. Is it fair to say that your concerns about the smoke control system related both to the fact it did not work and the poor state of maintenance?
Yes.
Now, if we can stay in this particular statement and go forward to paragraph 19 at page 7. And 6 lines down from the top to the end of that paragraph, you say this, and I quote, the 2 reasons why I decided, following my inspection of Grenfell Tower on the 12th of March 2014, an NOD, that's a notice of deficiencies, rather than an enforcement notice, was a proportionate response were, first, in my dealings with KCTMO as a responsible person, they generally acted on Brigade advice and could in most cases be trusted to take remedial action within set timescales. Second, I was aware a major refurbishment of the premises was imminent and that the refurbishment would be subject to building control oversight. Now, can you explain what previous experience with the TMO provided you with reassurance that they generally took the necessary remedial action within the set timescales?
Well, if you think, I had undertaken quite a number of audits within TMO premises, and in not every case were leaseholder doors or flat entry doors presenting themselves as an issue. So this is not just high-rise, but this is across their housing stock. And where minor repairs were identified, they were often quickly actioned. Janice Ray was efficient in taking those things forward. As far as I understood at the time, that was certainly the feedback that we got from them and the feedback that we got from my team leader in the bi-monthly meetings. So I had reasonable confidence that in most cases, apart from flat entry doors, they would generally deal with the issues we raised.
And in relation to flat entry doors, your concerns regarding economy with the truth was limited to that issue and didn't inform your broader take on their compliance?
Often it was very difficult to get test records for fire safety systems. They were just not provided with, and we were given assurances that these things were tested, but when you wanted the proof of that, it wasn't forthcoming. Most of my thought in that was in relation to the flat entry doors, where we've been told they had very few non-compliant doors. My experience was they had many more than they said they had.
You say there, you refer to the fact that refurbishment would be subject to building control oversight. Why was building control's involvement a source of reassurance for you?
It means that the project as a whole would have to be considered by qualified architects, qualified fire engineers. It would have a consultation with the fire service to actually discuss the existing and proposed changes to the premises. And so there were a lot of professionals who would be looking at the detail of the proposals, and those plans should be then enacted, obviously, on site, which should, in theory, make a much safer premises at the end of the process.
Thank you. Can we turn to the notice of deficiencies itself, which can be found at LFB 000-32101 and /3. And if I could look at Article 11 in particular, and the right-hand column, it stated this in respect to the AOV, and I quote, implement effective monitoring of preventive and protective measures. And we don't need to go to it, but the deadline for remediation action was prescribed as being the 5th of May 2014. And if we can just hold that in our minds and turn to the third statement for the police that you prepared, which is at Met 0071003/5, and the first paragraph on that page and the last 3 lines, you say, in relation to the date by which action was required, and I quote, this needed to be addressed quickly to better protect both residents and firefighters. I gave them until May 2014 to rectify this, having conducted the audit in March. I felt after discussion with Janice, this was a good time frame to complete the works, close quote. Can you help us? What precisely did you require the TMO to have done by the 5th of May 2014?
To make sure the existing system, which was in place, was effectively working.
Now, if we can turn, and apologies for jumping around the statements, Mr. Ramsey, if we can turn to your first statement to this inquiry, LFB 000-32092/7 and paragraph 23.2. And at the end of the second line, you say this, I described this as a minor deficiency. So that's in relation to Article 11 and the AOV, as Janice Ray had satisfied me that there was a plan in place to address this during the refurbishment. Can you remember now the gist of what you were told about the refurbishment, about the plan that you were referring to in paragraph 23.2?
I was told in general terms there was a plan to replace the smoke ventilation system at Grenfell Tower. I think it was understood that it didn't, even at the time of its own, the original system didn't meet any recognised standard even at the time, and certainly didn't meet any modern recognised standard for an AOV system. So my thought was, because there is a plan to rectify the problem, it's reasonable to see that as a minor deficiency because they had that plan in place. But also it's sufficiently important for me to mention it and to require them to fix the existing system to make the best possible conditions in the event of a fire.
Now, by the 5th of May 2014 deadline, had you been told that the deficiency had been remedied by anyone at the TMO?
No.
To the best of your knowledge, was anyone else in the fire safety team told that the deficiency had been remedied?
I'm not aware.
Now, could I turn to TMO 1008792/2, which should be the minutes of the TMO Health and Safety meeting held on the 2nd of November 2014. Actually, that was my fault. Could I ask you to go to the first page of that just so people can see what we're referring to? There we go. Health and Safety meeting on the 21st of November 2014. We go back to the top of page 2 and the end of the first line. It says that in regards to the vents, Rydens were sourcing a contractor to get the works done as soon as possible. It is likely to be after Christmas. Rydens have explained to the LFB that the system is beyond economical repairs, and LFB are aware to be appropriately equipped when arriving to deal with fires, close quotes. Had you been informed that the AOV was beyond economical repair?
No.
Were you told that the AOV would not be repaired pending the works to upgrade the AOV?
No.
To the best of your knowledge, was anyone else on the fire safety team told that the AOV would not be repaired pending the works to upgrade the AOV?
No.
Now, we know that the new upgraded AOV was not operational till the end of April 2016. Was that something about which you were ever made aware of during your time on the fire safety team at Kensington and Chelsea?
No.
To the best of your knowledge, was anyone else on that fire safety team made aware of that information?
No.
Can I now turn to a separate and different topic, and that is auditing the evacuation strategy for vulnerable and disabled residents. Now, if I could ask you to go to LFB 000-32293. Now, this is an LFB Fire Safety Information and Guidance Note. Its reference is it F-sign 114? And in broad terms, can you explain what the purpose of this document was?
It's not for me to undertake the team plan, so that would be for my team leader to prepare the team plan. He'd be better to comment on that than I was.
Okay. Can you help us if we can just turn to page 6? It may be a matter in which you can assist us, but please say if you can't. And if we can go to paragraph 5.14, it's roughly halfway down there. IO, so that's inspecting officer, is that right?
That's correct.
Should, and if we go 3 down from the bottom, focus on evacuation strategy, especially for those with mobility issues. Now, was the evacuation strategy for disabled persons or vulnerable persons something you assessed during the course of your inspection?
I don't believe it was, no.
Why not?
That's a good question. I wish I had. But in most cases in a general needs block, there was very little that the TMO could do in the event of a fire to assist vulnerable people. And I wasn't aware of any vulnerable people who were in that building. I hadn't been made aware of that.
Now, could I just follow up on what you say there? You say there was very little that the TMO could do in the event of a fire to assist vulnerable people. Could you put some flesh on that outline answer so the panel understand the difficulties you're referring to there?
Of course. So if there's a fire in a premises and a person needs to evacuate from their premises, an alert has to be raised, people have to be, in most cases, an individual, if they had severe mobility problems, may be trapped in their own home. Now, by the time that anybody would get to them, it's highly unlikely that somebody, a member of the public, a caretaker, state services, whoever it might be, from the TMO, would be safely able to assist that individual. So the focus of fire safety is really to make sure that the common parts are available for the people who need, not necessarily the fire safety within the house itself. It's a difficult area because we know that there are, difficult individuals have particular problems within their flats, and we strove to identify those issues and deal with them on a case-by-case basis with our community fire safety teams.
And how do you deal with it on a case-by-case basis? If you can give the panel some practical experience on the issues that are confronted and the difficulties that have to be overcome.
Of course. So if an individual, for instance, needs assistance to move within their own home, maybe they're bedbound, maybe if they are at particularly high risk, such as a smoker, or have a particularly high-risk fire behaviour, maybe they, for some reason, like to use candles or something of that ilk, then they will look at how they can help that individual, maybe giving them fire-resistant bedding, maybe giving personal suppression systems, which are designed to act around the individual if they're sitting in a particular chair. Just helping them to avoid foot trips and falls, for instance, by making sure there's good housekeeping within the flat and the flat is clean and tidy, things are put away. The practical steps that can be taken.
Thank you, Mr. Ramsey. Just for the sake of fairness and context, am I right in understanding that inspecting officers are not prompted to assess evacuation strategy for disabled and vulnerable persons in the premises inspection and data form?
Yes.
Are you able to assist as to why that question is not on the premises inspection and data form? It may be something for your superiors rather than for you.
I believe you're correct. It's not for me to answer.
Do you know why, though?
I don't.
Thank you. Could I now turn to a separate distinct topic, which is the suitability and sufficiency of the 2012 FRA? So that's the one you provided with after your site visit on the 12th of March 2014. Now, if we can turn to LFB 000-83856/4, which should be the premises information form. There we go. And in relation to Article 9 of the order, you say there that the FRA was, in the observation box, you say this, undertaken in 2012 by Carl Stokes, due for review in Jan 14, but not reviewed as of mid-March 14. Generally suitable and sufficient. However, insufficient information provided about the smoke ventilation arrangements. Email to Janice Ray suggesting this is covered in the impending review, confirmed as arranged. You recalled that it was broadly compliant on the left-hand side. Do you remember why the information was insufficient about the smoke ventilation system? You may well have answered this, but I just want to put the point directly to you.
It didn't evaluate whether the existing system was suitable for purpose. It didn't comment on the maintenance arrangements to any suitable degree, and I'd seen very obvious deficiencies that anybody walking around the building would have seen. And for me, it just had the whole area of smoke ventilation to common parts had been given insufficient consideration.
Notwithstanding those points, how was the compliance level of broadly compliant reached? Was that something, again, that was determined automatically by the software, or was it your qualitative judgment on what you'd seen?
This was my judgment, so that it wasn't the software.
So can you help us then, notwithstanding the various deficiencies and omissions you'd found, why you reached nonetheless the view that compliance was broad or broadly compliant?
Yeah, it's up to each individual officers to determine what is broadly compliant. There was this one area of weakness, a particular weakness, which I've made comment to note, and I followed up with Janice. I think I think this is maybe a little bit of gaming the system as well. If I had made it a higher priority at this point, the audit form would have probably indicated that an enforcement notice was more appropriate to issue on the premises. However, on the basis that I was aware that there were plans to make significant improvements through the refurbishment, I didn't feel an enforcement notice was appropriate. I thought that was too heavy-handed where there were plans in place, and so I took this approach.
Thank you, Mr. Ramsey. Could we turn to a separate document now, which is CST*00115, and it's an email you sent to Janice Ray on the 14th of March. We've looked at just a few moments ago. And if we look at the first line, if we can expand that, if we look at the first line, it said, I'm assuming it, so the FRA, wasn't reviewed in Jan 14 as per the front cover. And then you say, no great problem there, as little has changed, especially for the residential areas. I would suggest we ask Carl to review the FRA as it relates to the smoke control system. Why was a review of the FRA as it related to the smoke control system necessary? Was it because of the issues you just identified?
Yes. And that the system, I wanted to be sure that the TMO had evaluated the system as being suitable for the premises.
No time frame for the FRA review seems to have been set out there. Did you suggest a deadline for review of the FRA?
No, I don't believe I did.
And why not?
I believe in conversations that I knew it was ready to be reviewed, and I believe in my conversations with Janice that I'd received assurances that this would be reviewed.
Thank you. Can I now turn to LFB 000-83856/, 10. And this again is the premises information form. And if we see in the audit conclusions box, which is the last half of the penultimate line, you say FRA reported as to be imminently reviewed. Given the absence of a time frame, why did you say the FRA was to be imminently reviewed?
I believe what I'm saying here is that Janice has reported to me that the FRA is to be reviewed imminently.
Thank you. If we can go now to CST quadruple 02513. And if we go to the middle of the page, you'll see this is email correspondence between Ray and Stokes. You're not copied in. It's sent on the 14th of March 2014. And Janice Ray forwarded your email to Carl Stokes and wrote, I don't, and this is in the second sentence, I don't actually think there is much point in asking you to redo the FRA in view of the imminent works, when what he is really anxious about is reinstating the vet. I think she means the vent there. Now, in fact, we know that the FRA was only completed on the 17th of October 2014, some 5 months or more after this correspondence. Was a review in October 2014 consistent with the spirit of the concerns you'd outlined in relation to the smoke control system?
No.
When would you have considered it to have been reasonable to have completed the review, given what you identified?
I would have expected that review to have begun at least within the next month.
If you'd known that the review would not be done until October 2014, would that have informed or changed the approach you took to enforcement action?
Yes.
In what regards?
Had I known that they were taking the replacement or the repair of the ventilation system so lightly, I would have certainly issued an enforcement notice or recommended that an enforcement notice be issued.
And the decision as to whether that notice should be issued was one for your team leader, is that right?
Yes, it would be rare for my team leader to change the decision that I'd made.
But nonetheless, he or she had that discretion?
Absolutely, yes.
Now, can I turn to a separate and distinct topic, which is concerns about the TMO and Carl Stokes? And could I ask you to turn to the third statement you prepared for the police, which is at MET 0071003/5, and the third paragraph. And you say in the opening lines, we've looked at the balance of this paragraph earlier, but you say in the opening lines, my relationship with Janice and Carl over the years had, at times, been prickly. I've had disagreements with Carl over the various ways he approaches things, and the local authority didn't like the way I approached enforcement, especially as I had been forced to give them several enforcement notices and notices of fire safety deficiencies over the years. And if we can turn to your second statement to the inquiry, which is at LFB 000838555/8 and paragraph 21. In the third line, you say this, and I quote, I generally maintained a good relationship with Carl. On occasion, he would be difficult and would seek to rely on the lack of Brigade comments or an alternative view on a previous inspection as justification for the adequacy of fire safety measures at a given premises. And if we can get over the page to the last line, you say this, I recall conversations with other members of my team who had similar concerns about this aspect of Carl's approach. Now, can you give the panel the gist of the difficulties you'd encountered with Carl Stokes that you refer to in your statement to the police?
Yes, so when I found a deficiency, such as, let's take the ventilation system at Grenfell Tower, the fact that a previous inspecting officer may not have made similar comments to mine or similar observations to mine, he would use that as an argument to suggest that what you didn't find it a problem last time, why are you finding it a problem this time? So he would challenge the inspection on that basis. As we've noted that we didn't always inspect the whole of a premises, we took a sampling approach. So there were times when things were not seen during one inspection and were seen in the next.
Can you now remember which other team members had similar concerns to about Mr. Stokes?
I recall discussing this with Ben Dewis, with Robert McTague, with probably James Swindells and possibly other members of the team as well.
And were there concerns of a similar nature?
Very similar.
How, if at all, were those concerns raised within the fire safety team?
We would all have a free conversation with our team leaders at that point. So if I had that concern, I would have discussed that with Nick Comrie initially, then with Rebecca Burton. I would expect those concerns to be raised at the bi-monthly team meetings.
And were you given assurances that those concerns were in fact raised by Mr. Comrie and Ms. Burton in the bi-monthly meetings?
Not directly.
Were you satisfied that they'd done enough to act upon the concerns that had been shared by you and other members of the fire safety team?
All I can say is I think they understood the team's concerns and had enough information to take that forward.
Thank you. Can I now turn to CST 0003157/8? And if we look at the last paragraph, I should say this is the FRA of October 2014 in relation to the tower carried out by Mr. Stokes. And he said this, and I quote, in relation to your visit on the 12th of March 2014, the fire officers did not comment either at the time of the audit or in any correspondence after the audit about the building's layout, the means of escape routes, compartmentation, etc. Nor were there any comments about the positioning or siting of the fixed systems within the building, only about the maintenance of the systems. No adverse comments were received either about the management policies, procedures and arrangements in place within this building at the time of the audit. Therefore, has been assumed that the fire authority were completely satisfied with these arrangements at the time of the audit, and there have been no changes to the residential part of the premises or the TMO's management policies or procedures since the above fire safety audit was undertaken. Did you ever see the October 2014 FRA?
Yes.
Is his description about what you and or Daniel Hallisey did or did not comment on correct?
Absolutely not.
In what ways was it incorrect?
Well, I'd already highlighted deficiencies with the training of staff members and the procedures in relation to training, about maintenance issues in relation to, and that maintenance issues are seen as management arrangements in our view, about emergency lighting and about the smoke management system. So I don't believe those comments are accurate.
Now, you've touched on the substance in previous answers, but I'd like to ask you directly, is Mr. Stokes correct to say that if the LFB didn't specifically comment or didn't comment adversely on any relevant arrangements, it was, quotes, completely satisfied, close quotes, with those arrangements?
No.
And that's for the reasons you've given earlier?
Yes.
Did you give any assurance to that effect to Janice Rail Carl Stokes, either in relation to Grenfell inspection on March 2014 or indeed on any other occasion?
No.
Can I now turn to the enforcement notice issued in relation to Adair Tower? And can I ask you to turn to RBK 0002273? Now, this is the enforcement notice issued in relation to Adair. And I think it was served in December 2015, is that right?
Yes.
And if we go to page 2, we can see in the bottom third of the page, reply to Inspecting Officer Matthew Ramsey.
Yes.
Now, at page 2, and if we could de-amplify, it states that the notice has been copied to Janice Ray in the Housing Department of RBKC. Why did you copy the Housing Department of RBKC when you served and issued the enforcement notice?
Similar to the reply I gave earlier, that's the instructions I received from my team leaders.
And again, were you given any explanation as to why he required that pattern to be followed?
I think there was an understanding that both the TMO and RBKC had responsibilities in respect to the premises. This is an enforcement notice. It's a serious letter, and it needed to be made known to both organisations.
Mr. Ramsey, thank you. Sir, I've reached the end of my prepared questions. Might I have the usual opportunity to see if I've missed out anything, or indeed whether there are any other relevant questions that anyone else would like me to ask?
Yes, well, that's a very convenient point. We were going to have a break in the morning about this time anyway, Mr. Ramsey, but we always have a break at the end of Council's questions just to let him check he hasn't overlooked anything or to see if other people who are not actually in the room want to suggest further questions. So we'll have a break now. How long do you think you might need for questions?
10 minutes, sir.
Well, I'm going to say 11:30, so we can all have a break. So we'll come back, please, Mr. Ramsey, at 11:30 and see if there are any more questions for you. While you're out of the room, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence or anything relating to it.
Yes, sir.
All right? Good. Would you like to give the usher then, please? Thank you very much. 11:30.
Thanks, sir.
Yes, would you ask Mr. Ramsey to come back in, please? Right, Mr. Ramsey, well, we'll see if there are any more questions for you. Yes, Mr. Kinnear?
Mr. Ramsey, you may be pleased or relieved to know there are no further questions. And the only thing that leaves it for me to say is to say thank you very much for attending the inquiry today. It's much appreciated.
Thank you.
Yes, and I should thank you as well, Mr. Ramsey, on behalf of myself and the rest of the panel. It's always very useful to hear what people who are directly involved in these things have to say. And we're very grateful to you for coming up today to give your evidence. I hope it hasn't inconvenienced you too much, but we've certainly found it useful. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Kinnear, we've got another witness waiting to give evidence. Is that right?
We do, sir. And sir, I might ask you to rise. Just to
Oh,
allow
I think
the
we'll have to
arrangement.
rise for a moment because we have to make preparations for a change of witness and so on.
Thank you.
So we'll do that and then we'll move on as swiftly as we can. So perhaps you could ask the usher to come and tell us when you're ready.
I shall do so. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Kinnear. Now, your next witness.
Andrew Jack, please.
Good. Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Jack.
Good
I
morning,
understand you're going to take the oath.
I am.
So there should be a testament there. Would you take it in your right hand and read the words on the screen, please?
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Now sit down, make yourself comfortable.
Thank you.
Right? Yes, Mr. Kinnear, when you're ready.
Would you please confirm your name for the record?
Andrew Jack.
Good morning, Mr. Jack. Thank you for attending today. 3 bits of advice before we start. First of all, if any time during the course of examination you require a break, please say so. That's not a problem. Secondly, if at any time my question is unclear, again, don't hesitate to say so, and I'll attempt to rephrase it so that it is clear. Thirdly, would you mind keeping your voice up? That's so that the shorthand writer can capture everything you say and everything you say accurately. Now, you have made 3 statements following the fire at Grenfell Tower, is that right?
It is.
And if we can go to the first, which is a Metropolitan Police statement dated the 7th of May 2019, which is at Met 0004001/2. Sorry, don't need to do the /. That's the statement.
It is.
And could we go to LFB 000322244? And is that your first statement to this inquiry dated the 29th of January 2019?
It is.
Thirdly and finally, LFB 001200308. And is that your second statement to this inquiry dated the 5th of February 2021?
It is.
Have you read those statements recently?
I have.
And subject to any clarifications and corrections which, if relevant, will come to, are the contents true?
They are.
Thank you. And are you content for those statements to stand as your evidence to this inquiry?
I am.
Thank you. Now, first of all, can I ask you about your role at the London Fire Brigade? Is it right that you began working for the London Fire and Emergency Planning Authority and the Commissioner in the Fire Safety Regulation Department on the 1st of May 2007?
That's correct.
And you explained that you were, initially at least, a specialist advisor in respect of fire safety regulatory matters. Is that right?
That's correct.
And can you help the panel, in broad terms, what did that role involve?
Initially, it was review of how the brigade was implementing the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order, assisting with interpretation to allow for policies to be developed and adjusted. As I believe the inquiry knows, I was one of the authors of the Fire Safety Order in a previous life, and they asked me to assist on that basis.
Thanks. You then say that your current role is that of Head of Fire Safety Enforcement, a role which you've held since the 1st of July 2010. Is that right?
It is, although I've recently moved to be Strategic Technical Advisor, as I think I mentioned in my last statement.
And what was the gist of the responsibilities of your position as Head of Fire Safety Enforcement with the LFB?
2 principal areas. One was the oversight of investigations of potential offences, carrying those forward through a small team. The other was to assist with more difficult enforcement problems and also take an overview of enforcement activity in terms of the quality of notices. Clearly a fair amount within that, but principally those areas.
Thank you. How did your role sit in the hierarchy compared to the likes of Nicholas Comrie and Rebecca Burton, who were team leaders of fire safety in their respective boroughs?
The role was graded at FRS-G, which by comparison to Rebecca, a team leader would be at E, and F would be an area manager. For Nick Comrie, that's operational equivalent to station commander or station manager. At that time, I reported to one of the Deputy Assistant Commissioners for the majority of my work and to the Assistant Commissioner for small parts of it.
Thank you. Just to clarify one point, in paragraph 10 of your inquiry statement of January 2019, you describe yourself as the head of the Central Regulatory Enforcement Group of the LFB. Is that any different to the head of Fire Safety Enforcement?
No, the head of Fire Safety Enforcement heads that group, and
Now, was it in respect of those 2 roles that you had dealings with RBKC, TMO and Carl Stokes?
It was.
Now, can I now start to look in more detail about the substance of the contact you had with those three bodies, and particularly in the context of flat entrance doors? Now, did the LFB consider that the guidance for responsible persons about standards for flat entrance doors in purpose-built blocks were primarily those set out in the LGA's guide?
Primarily, yes, it had overtaken the government guide in that regard.
Were you familiar with the substance and requirements of the guide?
Reasonably so, though it wasn't part of my day-to-day duties.
Would you have expected responsible persons to have been familiar with the substance of the guide?
Absolutely.
And fire risk assessors they may retain?
Absolutely.
Now, at page 3 of your MET statement at paragraph 2, we don't need to go to it, but the reference is MET 0004001/3, lines 1 to 7. You say this, and I quote, "My specific dealings with RBKC, TMO and Carl Stokes originally rose around September 2012 through the LFB Fire Safety Team Leader for the Borough, Station Manager Nicholas Comrie. SM Comrie was in discussion with the TMO about improvements to flat front doors, protecting means of escape in case of fire in blocks of flats under their control, and in particular about which enforcing authority, RBKC or LFIPA, should act in respect of the provision of suitably fire-resisting doors that were self-closing. This particularly related to doors that were demised to individual leaseholders. Had you had any involvement with that issue before then?"
It's always been a problem. So the national protocol that was brought in and we sought to have with all the different boroughs, it was a known problem from the first days of the order around who would enforce the overlap between the Housing Act and the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order.
And can I take it from that, when you say it's always been a problem, by that you mean it's not been a problem specific to RBKC, it's been of broader application?
There is a broad issue with the overlap of the Housing Act and the Fire Safety Order.
But it wasn't an RBKC specific issue?
No.
And why were you involved or brought in at this stage in relation to RBKC, TMO and Carl Stokes?
So far as I can recall, it was because there was disagreement around who should enforce in any particular case. And with my knowledge of the Fire Safety Order, I was asked to look at what was being said and form a view.
Okay. And form a view,
Well,
saying what?
What should the Brigade's position be and report that through to others, including the Assistant Commissioner.
Did that involve you having to take a view as to who was the responsible person in relation to housing stock managed by the TMO on behalf of RBKC?
It did.
And what was that view that you reached?
A very difficult one. I'm afraid I don't believe I ever got all of the papers. My personal view is the responsible person in the true sense is the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, but their tenant management organisation is their 5-3 person, and that in reality there is little to choose between them in terms of responsibility, given the level of responsibility applied by Article 5.3.
Thank you. Now can I turn to the very specific topic of the meeting on the 8th of November 2012 between yourself, RBKC and the TMO. Now, in your police witness statement, we don't need to go to it, but the reference is MET 0004001/6, last paragraph. You deal with the meeting that you attended on the 8th of November with RBKC, TMO and LFB to discuss enforcement against leaseholders in respect of flat entrance doors which were not compliant with the relevant fire safety standards. Is that a fair summary?
It is.
What was your role intended to be, at least by the LFB, at the meeting?
It was that we took the view that the Royal Borough should be enforcing as responsible person, and I think there was a degree of issue around how they were approaching that. So it was to represent the Brigade position and discuss with them how enforcement matters should be taken forward between us.
And what was Nicholas Comrie's role intended to be at the meeting?
He was effectively facilitated the meeting, as I recall it.
And Matthew Ramsey?
Was brought along by Nicholas Comrie.
Now, in the second paragraph of your MET statement, it's page 15, and you say, again, we don't need to go to it, but you say that an additional conversation took place after the meeting about the leaseholder enforcement issue had closed, the content of which you then set out at pages 15 to 20 of that statement. Now, you say that Janice Ray is correct to say that an additional conversation took place after the close of the meeting to discuss enforcement in respect to flat front doors. I recall these quite well due to the nature of the discussions, the context they were in, following on from the meeting with RBKC lawyers, and because much of what was said formed the basis for further discussion with others within the department, and with other house providers and fire risk assessors. Now, who was present for that additional conversation?
I believe when I wrote that statement that it was Janice Ray, the risk assessor, Nicholas Comery and myself, and that Matt Ramsey may have been present at the beginning. Having heard the evidence of Ms. Ray and Mr. Ramsey, I'm still reasonably convinced that they were both present at the beginning of that second session, but may have left further partway through it. I'm afraid I really don't recall at this stage, at this point in time now.
Who initiated the additional conversation?
Carl Stokes.
And can you remember what he opened with?
I think it was words to the effect of, there's a couple of matters I'd like to discuss with you.
Now, if I can take you to LFB 000-54653, and if we look at the bottom half of that page, we can see that Rebecca Burton emailed you and others on the 1st of November 2015, and we'll come back to that email in more detail later. But for now, can I ask you to look at your initial reply, which is at LFB 0003375. And we see second paragraph, first line. You say this: the meeting was to discuss enforcement generally in relation to flat front doors. Then if we skip to the third line, though my memory is pretty good, too much time has gone by to say if anything further was discussed. Do you remember that email?
I do.
Now, can you help us understand why in November 2015 your memory was not so good as to allow you to give much detail, but over 19 months later you were able to record it in some detail in your police statement following the fire?
Certainly. It was that I'd had much greater opportunity to go back through old documents, and through those, that had caused me to recollect it and elements that were said. It may help if I say that it is visual prompts through emails that tend to prompt my memory to a very great extent. At this point in replying to Rebecca, I had not seen or been able to find very much information about that.
Thank you. Now, can we go to your MET statement, which is at MET 0004001/19, and it's the first sentence on that page, where you say this, and I quote, "By my recollection, we further discussed the issue of doors and door closers in relation to the maintenance and management requirements of the RRFSO under Article 17 and Article 11. The point being made by me that collectively there was a need not only to maintain doors and self-closing devices in an efficient state and good working order, but this should be subject to effective planning, organisation, control, monitoring and review. The extent of the monitoring and maintenance regime would need to be circumstances specific so that sufficient checks of the ongoing functionality of the fire-resisting doors and self-closing devices could be monitored and necessary remedial action undertaken in a timely manner." Now, during the discussion, did you discuss the substance of the monitoring and maintenance regime which should be put in place by the TMO?
I cannot recall in detail. I think this was a matter brought up by Carl Stokes around what maintenance was. We had the LGA guide with us, I think, and clearly Nick Comery is my technical advisor in particular. So I think we did within broad terms.
What did you mean when you said it should be, quote, circumstances specific, close quotes?
Particularly, clearly there are normally expected standards for ongoing checks and maintenance. In the case of flat front doors, I think, if I remember correctly, that is 6 monthly. But there could be examples within blocks that would initiate much more regular checks, particularly vandalism, arson, things like that, which may mean that that standard is actually not good enough and you need to do more.
So you're absolutely clear that frequency of checks was considered and discussed?
I'm quite certain that it was.
Did you discuss what types of checks or inspections would be required?
I'm afraid I can't recall.
Did you discuss who would be expected to carry out the checks or inspections on the doors and self-closing devices?
merely that it would be within the TMO's remit to have that done, but they did through a contractor or members of their staff would not have been an issue for me.
Was the TMO's flat entrance door replacement programme discussed in the context, i.e. what the maintenance monitoring requirements were for the replacement doors?
Not in that context, though from that discussion I was aware there was a door maintenance programme.
And were you aware, sorry, not maintenance programme, replacement?
I beg your pardon, my fault, replacement programme.
Thank you. And at that stage, had you been given any information as to how far gone that replacement programme was and what the maintenance regime was in respect of those new doors?
No, not that I can recall.
Did you discuss what monitoring maintenance requirements were in place by the TMO at that stage?
We may have done, but I'm afraid I can't recall that detail.
You said you had the LGA guide before you. Can you remember now whether you drew the TMO's specific attention to paragraphs 82.3 and 82.4 regarding the regularity, the 6-monthly basis for the maintenance and inspection programme?
If my memory serves me correctly, it was actually Carl Stokes that had the copy of the guide with him. We had come into the meeting without. I cannot recall whether we specifically went to that paragraph now.
Can you remember whether he took you to those paragraphs?
I'm sorry, I can't.
No. Can you remember, apologies if I'm pushing my luck, can you remember what impression he gave you of his familiarity with the substance of the requirements in respect of maintenance and monitoring in relation to flat entrance doors set out in the guide?
I can't recall anything that led me to think he was not familiar with what have been quite standard requirements for many years.
And can you remember what response the TMO gave to you when you set out what you thought a proper, suitable and sufficient maintenance and monitoring programme should look like?
I believe they considered it would be difficult to achieve because of the nature of the buildings,
And what was your response to that?
but it was nonetheless what they needed to do. It was the legal requirement.
Now, if we stay in this statement, and in particular this paragraph, and we go to the 8th line down, it starts with the words, "my recollection." And you go on to say this, "My recollection is that it was at this point that checking of fire-resisting compartmentation generally, as part of the fire risk assessment process, was also discussed. The point being raised, though I cannot recall by whom, that gaining access to flats to undertake any sort of intrusive check, such as drilling into ceilings to confirm their construction and fire resistance, was difficult and may be contrary to the terms of lease or tenancy. I highlighted the possibility of carrying out these types of checks in flats which had become vacant or, as it is known, a void." Did that discussion about checking of fire-resisting compartmentation generally include checks to flat entrance doors and self-closing devices specifically?
In the latter part of what I say in the paragraph, the primary element was where insufficient information was known about a building, or the responsible personal risk assessor had cause to think there may be something they weren't aware of. There was an opportunity without disturbing leaseholders or tenants generally to be able to carry out a thorough and potentially more intrusive check of the structure, levels of fire protection and so forth within a flat without causing inconvenience to others.
And does it flow from that answer that types of checks referred to in this paragraph referred both to fire compartmentation, flat entrance doors, and other matters as well?
Could you expand on what you mean by other matters?
Well, no, take it fire compartmentation first of all. You use the word comprehensive, Mr.
Yes.
Jack, so what I was trying to do was draw out what other matters.
I follow. Yes, if they were going to look in a void flat, they would have good opportunity to be able to expose behind meters, drill into ceilings to see what depth of plasterboard or other type of ceiling might be there, open up areas such as around soil pipes, which have been a bone of contention, not with RBKC in fact, but others around what was covered, and actually check things like that, including getting into if there was a communal heating system, ventilation system, such as have been looked at La Canal, that those things could be readily checked from a void flat, where it would be much more difficult to do from a tenanted flat.
Thank you. Mr. Jack, just following on from that answer about the types of checks that ought to be carried out, you say in the same paragraph, 4th line from the end of the paragraph, You say this: another check that I was aware of being applied was a less intrusive check of the self-closer and any obvious compartmentation issues such as fire stopping around pipework, which was done at the time of a landlord's gas safety check, though clearly that would not be applicable in all cases. Now, why did you consider that checking the self-closer device during the landlord's gas safety check would be sufficient?
I didn't consider it to be sufficient as an entire check or maintenance regime. This was something which, in terms of enforcement, we are required under the Enforcement Concordat and its later models to seek to enforce proportionately in a reasonable manner where we don't overimpose burdens. The same really applies for the responsible person. If there was an opportunity to enter the flats while doing another check, it might make it easier to gain access generally. If you're looking at twice a year, once look at the self-closers and anything else, once where you were already going to do a gas safety check, you would not then necessarily need to go in a third time just to conduct the self-closer check. You could incorporate the two together. That was what I was getting at.
Thank you. Were any other options for carrying out internal flat entrance door checks discussed at the meeting?
Not that I recall.
Was any agreement reached at the meeting as to what the TMO's maintenance monitoring regime for flat entrance doors should be?
No.
At any point, did you discuss what checks of flat entrance doors and self-closing devices the LFB expected to be carried out during a fire risk assessment?
I'm afraid I can't recall whether that would have come under Mr. Comery, though I would have no doubt contributed, but I can't recall if we did.
Now, if we stay in this statement and turn over the page to page 20, and the second paragraph from the bottom, it starts with the words, "at the closing of the meeting." You go on to say, "I believe Carl Stokes summarised the discussions from his notes and said he would make arrangements with SM Comery for the premises that had been discussed to be visited by him and SM Comery or his team. He and Janice Ray would also look into the use of void flats to check construction and fire compartmentation." Now, by saying you would look into the use of void flats to check construction and fire compartmentation, did you understand that to include checks to flat entrance doors and self-closing devices?
I think I would have assumed it to, as a thorough look at that flat and what was in it.
You say assume. Did you make clear your assumption to Mr. Stokes and Miss Ray?
At this point in time, I'm afraid I couldn't say.
Thank you. Now, can I turn to a separate topic, which is an email from Janice Ray to Matthew Ramsey on the 18th of December 2013. And if I could ask you to turn to LFB 0003534. And it's an email we looked at with Mr. Ramsey, and you'll see there item 1, where Miss Ray set out their regime that was applied, and she noted Mr. Ramsey's concern about self-closing devices and said this: "I would reiterate," in the second line, "I would reiterate our approach to flat entrance doors, which, as I believe you are aware, has been discussed with your colleagues at the LFB consistently over recent years, and again at our regular meeting yesterday. Specifically, in relation to the tenant's door, our approach is as follows. When replacement flat entrance doors are fitted, they are fire-rated and self-closing. When properties become void, self-closers will be reinstated, installed as necessary. At other times, when major work has been undertaken in a dwelling, the self-closer will be reinstated if it has been disconnected." My first question is, do you recall ever seeing this email? Was it ever forwarded to you?
Not that I recall, though I have seen it since.
Now, it suggests that for doors with self-closers installed or fitted, those self-closers would only be inspected and reinstated if necessary when the property became void or major work was undertaken. The first and obvious question is, did you consider that approach to be consistent with the advice and guidance you'd given at the meeting on the 8th of November 2012?
No.
Can you help the panel as to in which respects you consider this approach to be lacking?
This appears from the 3 bullet points that suggest that this would be the only maintenance regime being conducted. I would not consider that to be suitable because it would leave far too much time potentially between checks. This would appear to state that somebody may have moved into a flat 30 years ago and it will never be checked until they have moved out in 5 years' time and a new tenant moves in. That will be wholly unacceptable.
In your discussion with the TMO and RBKC, had you approved the approach which Ms. Ray summarises there?
No.
To the best of your knowledge, do you know whether anyone in the LFB who had dealings with the TMO approved such an approach?
I do not know of anybody who has, and I cannot think of anybody who would.
Can you just tell me with this? Did the LFB actually give bodies who are operating flats, large buildings, any advice as to what you would regard as an appropriate maintenance regime in practical terms?
I think there may have been something within one or more of the guidance notes issued by the Brigade in respect to flat front doors, but I would need to check, I'm afraid, sir.
It's very easy to say, well, you must check your doors every 6 months, but
yes.
The response is how? And what's the answer to that question?
I'm afraid I think that is one that, with the different working methodologies of landlords, leases and tenants, we expected them to come to a view on how they would be able to achieve it, rather than us seeking to direct things that they must do in that regard. That may not have been ideal.
Sounds like a problem that's too difficult for you to suggest the answer to.
I certainly think the comeback one gets from property owners around anything which is brought forward such as that can be problematic.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, sir. Can I now turn to a separate topic, which is contact and communication with Rebecca Burton?
Mm-hmm.
Now, if we if we go back to your Met statements, that's Met 0004001/14. In the second paragraph on that page, you deal with an email Rebecca Burton sent you, Nicholas Comrie and Nicholas Coombe on the 1st of November 2015, and which we looked at earlier. And if we can go to that email, which is at LFB 000054653/1, we see in the third paragraph, first sentence, Ms. Burton explained that recent inspections of TMO properties had shown that a significant number of flat entrance doors were not self-closing. And then she referred to a comment in Carl Stokes' FRA for Adair Tower that flat entrance doors are not self-closing, and this is in agreement with the LFB. She explained that Janice Ray had provided details of the meeting on the 8th of November 2012, incorrectly stated there, I think, to be 8th of November 2015, where this agreement was apparently reached, and raised concern about the LFB's change of position. Rebecca Burton sought information from you, Mr. Comrie and Mr. Coombe, as to what was discussed at the meeting in November 2012. My first question is this: what did you make of the suggestion by Carl Stokes and Janice Ray that the LFB had, quotes, agreed at the meeting on the 8th of November 2012 that self-closing devices were not required on existing flat front entrance doors?
Frankly, sir, I was shocked.
And could you amplify the reasons for your shock?
Firstly, that I was quite certain, and I am quite certain, that no such agreement was given. Secondly, that Mr. Stokes is a former serving fire officer, that he has experience of such matters and has seen the devastation that can be caused by non-closing fire doors. I was, as I say, quite shocked that he would come to any conclusion that doors should not be self-closing.
Thank you. Can I now turn to a separate topic, which is review of the TMO fire safety strategy that touched upon flat entrance doors? And if I could ask you to go back to your Met statement, which is at Met 0004001/21, and the third paragraph on that page. And there you explained that after the fire, Rebecca Burton provided various documents to you at your request, including, set out in the final line, the TMO fire safety policy or strategy of September 2013, in which you say over the page at page 22 and the third paragraph down, you reviewed. Is that a fair summary of your evidence on that?
I believe so, yes.
Now, if we can go to page 24 of this statement, and it's the very bottom, you set out section 17.3 of the 2013 TMO fire safety strategy entitled LFB Required Standards for Flat Entrance Doors Within Enclosed Blocks. It does not set out a policy for the monitoring and maintenance of flat entrance doors. Is that a topic you would have expected to have seen in a fire safety strategy?
I would, as part of an overall maintenance regime, fire doors should clearly be within it.
And presumably particularly so after you'd met the TMO and the RBKC to discuss that very issue in November 2012.
We had met to discuss doors, and the matter of them needing to be fully functioning was a primary element of that meeting.
Thank you. Now, could we look at the 2017 TMO fire safety strategy, which was, or seems to have been improved on the 13th of June 2017, and that can be found at TMO 00847324/12. Now, this says, that you see roughly halfway down that page, the TMO has a variety of ongoing methods of ensuring that self-closing devices remain in place and remain operational. These include, but are not confined to, included in works to all void empty properties in advance of new tenant moving in, included in 6 monthly checks of all sheltered dwellings, included in monthly inspections of all temporary accommodation. When undertaking comprehensive FRA reviews, the assessor, access permitting, will inspect a number of flat entrance doors and their self-closing devices. Now, is that approach consistent with the advice and guidance you gave in the November 2012 meeting?
That does appear to be very much what we said, or what I believe we said.
And for the avoidance of doubt, would it follow that you consider that to be compliant with the requirements of the 2005 order?
I believe it would, although I note here it does say it's only 6 monthly checks of all sheltered dwellings.
I was about to come on to that.
If it were applied to all of the flats, I would say yes.
And because it misses out general needs housing, you consider that to be a material omission
I
from
do.
the maintenance regime that would be required?
Absolutely.
Now, one point that has been articulated is that in some way the LFB was specifically targeting RBKC and TMO, singling them out for special treatment when insisting that they should implement a planned preventative maintenance programme for self-closing devices. Now, what would be your response to that concern or allegation?
That it has no basis in fact.
Can you help us? Was your concern to ensure planned preventative maintenance programmes were in place for self-closing devices? Did that apply across all London boroughs for which you were responsible?
Absolutely. If we found there was a lack of maintenance and planning in any borough or any other housing provider, or indeed any other business for which we are the enforcing authority, that is a matter we would have pursued and do pursue with.
Now, can I turn to a separate topic, and it's one we touched on with Mr. Ramsey, and that was auditing the evacuation strategy for disabled persons. And could I ask us to go to LFB 000-32293? First of all, Mr. Jack, you're probably well placed to explain to us what a fire safety information and guidance note is, first of all.
It is a form of policy document used by the regulation department to set out what the policy we are operating under is and provide guidance to officers on how they should implement that policy.
What is the fire safety regulation team plan?
It's a plan primarily held or used at local team level to dictate where they will conduct their audits during the course of that year, made up of a combination of pre-planned inspections, revisiting existing premises that have been seen before, previously unknown premises, how they will respond to allegations of fire risk, for numbers and for planning purposes to sort out how much they can physically achieve with the number of staff they have.
Thank you. And could we turn to page 6 within this guidance note? And if we go to paragraph 5.14, we see IO, the inspecting officer, should, and look at the third bullet point from the bottom of that list, focus on evacuation strategy, especially for those with mobility issues. Now, is it correct that LFB inspecting officers are not prompted to assess that question on the premises inspection and data form?
I don't believe they are.
Can you help us, being a senior officer, as to why they are not so prompted?
I believe in the guidance or training to them, it has historically been largely limited to the identification of groups, which may then lead them on to that discussion, and would feature principally under the means of escape and the provision of information to people about it. It is taken much further in the sheltered housing side of it, and I think this has been lifted from there. But beyond that, I'm afraid I can't, because this rests with a different part of the office to me. So although I have an awareness of it, I'm not fully focused on that issue.
Hopefully the chairman and you won't mind if I press my luck somewhat, though.
Please feel free.
Notwithstanding that caveat. But given the absence of a prompt, how would the LFB expect its inspecting officers to focus on evacuation strategy, particularly as it affects those with mobility issues? How are you expecting them to do that, absent a prompt or any further guidance?
I think, as I said, the prompt is there for the assessment should consider groups of, or any group of vulnerable persons, and if the assessment raised that such persons may be present, then the inspector should be reviewing that against what was actually in place. But I'm not aware of a better prompt than that to them other than through their training.
Thank you. Can I stay on this topic of the vulnerable and disabled residents, and could I ask you to go to RBK 000-53712, which is an email from Claire Wise to Amanda Johnson and Celia Chaliscan, who were employees of RBKC working in their housing department. And this summarised a meeting about sheltered housing that she and Janice Ray attended with you, Nicholas Comrie and Nicholas Coombe, that morning. And if we could look at the fourth paragraph of this email, which starts, they believe. They stressed, They stressed, so I'm assuming that means you and or Mr. Coombe and or Mr. Comrie, stress that if there are residents in buildings that cannot independently evacuate or may have other needs that impact on their ability to carry out fire safety procedures, e.g. if they are hard of hearing, then the fire brigade need to know. Local fire stations do not need to be informed. It would be good practice for a list of residents with additional needs to be kept close to the fire alarm control panel. The information could be stored in, girder boxes?
Yep.
Or less expensive boxes locked with a fire brigade padlock key. The box should be marked for the attention of the fire brigade for use in the event of a fire. They believe that it is the person organisation who manages the building that has a duty to develop a plan with actions to be taken in the event of a fire and collect information on residents with additional needs, i.e. it is the responsibility of the landlord building manager to establish the needs of residents, though it is acknowledged that residents are able to decline to disclose this information if they choose. Risk assessments do not need to be updated if the needs of individual residents changes slightly or if a new resident moves in with no additional needs. It may be required to carry out a review of the risk assessment if a resident's needs significantly changes and or where that change in need is permanent. They suggested that where a resident cannot independently evacuate and the fire risk assessment requires an evacuation strategy, that a resident should be encouraged to move or other fire safety methods put in place, such as sprinklers for high-risk dwellings, e.g. if they are heavy smokers. I apologise, this is an email that's quite old. Mindful of that caveat, does that email reflect a fair summary of what was discussed with Claire Wise and others at that meeting?
I think, as I said in my statement, I cannot particularly recall the meeting. I have a feeling that it was one that Mr. Coombe walked across to my desk and asked me if I would join him at, and I've not found any particular record. I can only say that it does sound like what we were saying at that time as general messages.
Can you remember, mindful of the caveat you've given, whether the discussion extended to residents with disabilities in general needs housing?
I'm afraid I can't recall. I've, as I say, very little recollection of the meeting.
Can you recall Janice Ray's response or Claire Wise's response?
I'm afraid not.
Thank you. Now can I turn to a separate and distinct topic which relates to approved document B. Now, in your second statement of the inquiry, which can be found at LFB 001203008/9 and paragraph 30, you state this: I recall that at some point around 2013 to 2015, I attended a meeting between the LFB and DCLG with Brian Martin, in which B41 was discussed. I recall the point being made that ADB offered significantly less guidance in respect of the first limb of B41, the requirement for fire resistance across the face of a building, than for the second limb, the requirement to resist the spread of fire from one building to another. However, I do not have a clear recollection of this meeting, nor a written record. I believe that it was as a result of this meeting that I formed the impression a new version of ADB might be forthcoming, as I stated in my email of the 26th September 2016. Can you remember who arranged that particular meeting?
Arranged it? No, I'm afraid I can't.
Can you remember why it was taking place?
I think, and I can only say think, that it was part of the follow-up following Lacanal and issues arising from that and some other fires. There had been a number of issues around compartmentation and other building regulations matters, but there were a number of meetings that happened, and that's why I can't say which and when, I'm afraid.
Can you remember who was present?
Other than myself and Brian, I'm afraid not. I only remember that because the raising of this issue, I think, was actually by me, and I know Brian Martin as we worked together many years ago.
Did you consider the guidance in ADB to be clear in relation to the two limbs, the functional requirement B4 you've described?
No.
In what respects did you consider it to be lacking?
In my view, the lead through in ADB for B1 took you straight into B2, which led people to consider that the entire requirement was about spread between buildings. One had to go hunting around into previous paragraphs to be able to find some mention of fire spread within the area. It was an issue we had looked at as part of the investigation following the Lacanal fire.
Were you a lone voice on this, or were others expressing similar concerns regarding the clarity of B4?
Within the department, I would say it had become a collective view between those in enforcement and engineering and beyond.
And when you say department, you mean
The Fire Safety Regulation Department.
Acknowledging that you've said that your recollection of the meeting is not clear, bearing in mind the passage of time, can you assist us at all in the gist of what was discussed?
It was only around that part that I have particular recollection, and then really because it related to my recollection that Brian had said they would be approaching ministers to try and get a review of approved document B, and noted how difficult that may be, no matter I can clearly sympathise with him.
Why would that be difficult? What were his reasons for anticipating those difficulties?
I think at that time there was a significant element of localism, people should be doing things for themselves, and government not wanting to conduct further reviews against staff shortages, that type of thing. Not uncommon.
Do you recall Mr. Martin expressing any views himself about the interpretation, adequacy or clarity of B4?
Not at that meeting, although he had before during the Lacanal investigation.
And can you give us the gist of his views regarding interpretation, adequacy or clarity of B4?
I think to use the word that I've used earlier in seeing what others within the building industry had said, he was shocked that they could have reached such a conclusion that there was only the one requirement. There's been a historic view through I'll call the Building Regulations Department, if I may, as it's changed names so often, that the document was written for professionals within the building industry who would consequently understand it. But there was, I believe, some recognition by him that perhaps that was not being achieved to the extent that one might have hoped, and equally it was being read by others who were not necessarily so technically competent as the building control officers of his day, I might say.
Thank you. And in relation to the last line of this paragraph of your witness statement that we're looking at, when you say, I believe that it was a result of this meeting that I formed the impression a new version of ADB might be forthcoming, is there anything specific beyond what you've already said that created that anticipation in your mind that a new version would be forthcoming?
Only the comment that Brian had made to say they were looking to seek approval for the review of approved document B.
Thank you very much. Mr. Jack, I've come to the end of my prepared questions. Sir, might I have the usual indulgence, and might I ask for 10 minutes to see whether I've missed anything out, or indeed whether there are any relevant questions that others might want me to ask?
Yes, well, Mr. Jack, we do normally have a break at the end of council's questions, best to let him check that he hasn't left anything out, and to consider suggestions from others who aren't in the room for additional questions. So we will take a break now. I'm going to say 20 to 1, and when you come back, we'll see whether there are any more questions for you. I have to ask you, please, not to talk to anyone about your evidence or anything relating to it while you're out of the room.
Of course, Mr. Chairman.
If you go with the usher, we'll get you back as soon as we can. Right, 20 to 1 then, please.
Thanks, sir.
Thank you. Yes, would you ask Mr. Jack to come back in, please? Thank you. Right, Mr. Jack. Well, let's see if there are any more questions for you. Yes, Mr. Kinnear?
There are no further questions.
Oh.
So, Mr. Jack, thank you very much for attending the inquiry. It's greatly appreciated.
You're most welcome.
And it's right, I should thank you as well, Mr. Jack, on behalf of all members of the panel for coming along to give your evidence. It's been very helpful to hear from you. It hasn't taken very long, but that doesn't mean to say we haven't benefited very much from what you have to tell us. So thank you very much indeed. And now you're free to go. So
Thank you, Mr.
if you'd
Chairman.
like to go with the usher, that'll be way. Well, now, Mr. Kinnear, we have another witness, but perhaps not just yet. Is that right?
No, so if you're content, we can start Miss Matthews at 2 o'clock rather than having quarter of an hour. And
Then a break almost as soon as we started. Yes. Well, I think that would be sensible. So we'll break at that point and resume, please, at 2 o'clock.
Thanks, sir.
2 o'clock, please. Thank you.